The date is Tuesday, June 9th, 1959. It is a hot summer evening after spending a long day in school and then playing baseball with your friends. You are 14 years old. While biking around your neighborhood, you are approached by a child younger than you who is asking for a ride to the highway. And being friendly, you decide to give them that ride without realizing that you will be the last person who has ever seen this person alive again. You are soon faced with a murder charge, and any time you try to speak the truth, you are called a liar and shut down by police, and then jailed. This is the very true and accurate story of Stephen Truscott and Lynne Harper. Hi guys, I'm so sorry that it has taken me so long to get to you with part 2 of this story. I just want to say that there has been a little bit of some problems. I won't name names, but I did have some friends over and family to my home, and somebody got a little bit tipsy and threw up on my keyboard. So my computer was out of commission for a good couple of weeks and I couldn't do anything with it. I've replaced it now. Things had to be replaced, things had to be fixed, things had to be backed up, things had to be restored. So hopefully we won't have that again, and I'll be able to deliver this content to you as quickly as I can and as smoothly as I can. Secondly, if you guys are not familiar with this case, this is a very, very, very long story. It's over 50 years old, so just looking at the literature alone that I have to read is very overwhelming, but I promise you I will try to be quicker next time, and bear with me, I am doing my best. If you haven't seen Act 1 of this case, I will leave a link in the description box below, and you can link to that and watch it before watching this one. Strong tea. So let's get down to brass bicycles. So OPP officer Hank Sayu, who I have mentioned in the previous video, he and several other OPP officers worked all summer long following leads, but there was no inclination in any official records that specified they were looking at other people other than the 14-year-old boy that was already locked up and behind bars. Hank Sayu had only maybe one other possible suspect that he thought might have been responsible for this, and this was a 18-year-old boy, or man I guess, named Vaughn Marshall, and he was an airman. He was also only posted in Clinton for 10 days. On Thursday, June 11th, Sayu interviewed Vaughn Marshall, and Marshall had told Sayu that on June 9th, 1959, so 2 days previously, he was driving the outskirts of Clinton, and at around 7:05, 7:10, he noticed a 59 Chevy pass him on the outskirts, and it had a white hardtop, and it was a two-door. And he also said that it was painted like a whitish gray color. He also noticed that there was a man and a girl in the front seat, and that it was going approximately 45 to 50 miles per hour. The other interesting thing is that this car had PQ plates, which are license plates from Quebec. As I have specified in my last video, Quebec plates at that time had yellow in them, which was on the car that Stephen claimed to have seen pick up Lynne before she disappeared. Marshall also told Sayu that about 3 or 4 weeks prior to this incident, he was introduced to Lynne at a party on a Friday or Saturday night, and he said that he remembers seeing Lynne stay there until about midnight. Marshall told Sayu that on the Tuesday night that Lynne had disappeared, he had spotted her downtown in Clinton, and that she was standing on the street corner in front of the Tip Top Tailors and she was wearing blue shorts. And this was approximately 6:30 or 6:40 in the evening, but he said that's all he can remember. The police discredited all this information that Marshall was giving them because, first off, there was no way that Lynne could have left her house after eating dinner, traveled to downtown Clinton, and been at that street corner for 6:30. It just wasn't possible. And they also didn't think it was possible that Lynne would have stayed at a party until midnight. He said that after investigating Marshall's claims, he decided to check up on Marshall's alibi, who was his girlfriend. Seyu believes that Marshall was lying about how much he actually knew about Lynne because he just wanted to be part of a high-profile case. I find it fascinating that Stephen had multiple witnesses that had told police they had seen him and Lynne crossing the bridge together. Meanwhile, this one guy has one witness and police automatically dismiss him as a suspect. There were two witnesses that came forward and they claimed that they saw different parked cars by that bush the night that Lynne disappeared. And by Friday, when Stephen was arrested, authorities knew of 3 other sightings of a '59 Chevy, that specific model, in the area. One of these witnesses that claimed to have seen these cars was Bob Lawson himself. He said late that Tuesday night, he was walking to the swimming hole to have a swim, and he noticed there was a car that was parked near his bush, and this was the first sighting he had ever seen of a car parking near there. And he said that it was a red or maroon convertible, an older model, between a 51 and a 53, and there was a man that was sitting in the front seat. Bob also said that he thought he saw a younger girl that was in the front seat, but she was fairly shorter, so it was kind of hard to tell, and when he approached the car, the guy was kind of giving him a hard time. Minutes later, Lawson was swimming at the bridge, and he saw the maroon convertible driving over the bridge hollering at him, and Lawson just took it like, I interrupted their romantic date and he's pissed at me. 2 weeks after this incident happened, police actually managed to track down the convertible, and the man that owned it was an airman, and he fully admitted, he said, yes, I do take girls down the county road and I do park there. But he said that he actually parked closer to the bridge rather than to Lawson's bush, which was conflicting with Bob Lawson's story. The man also told police that he had sold the car 2 weeks after Lynne's murder, and for some unknown reason, the police didn't investigate further. Odd. There was also a separate incident that happened with a man named Donald Hall, and he was a person that fixed radar equipment on the base, but he didn't actually live on the base. That Tuesday night, Donald was actually driving back down the county road from the mess hall, which he stayed late to clean up. A mess hall is basically a cafeteria where all the airmen eat at together. And when he drove up, he passed by the bush and saw that there was a car that was parked at the bush. And it was a late model, it had heavy chrome, and there was one lone occupant that was there. He said he couldn't distinguish the make and model of the car, but he did know that it was older, and the lone occupant was wearing a light-colored shirt and had wavy dark hair. But he didn't look to be an RCAF occupant. Another separate incident involved a Corporal Arlene Stroman, who was at the Clinton base for 4 months doing radar training. After class that evening, Arlene and her girlfriends decided to go to the custard shop, and when they were leaving at 7 p.m., they were stopped by a '59 Chevy with 3 men inside, and they offered the girls a ride, which they respectfully declined, and they eventually sped off. When all of this started going down, the women decided to go to the guardhouse to tell the police officers that they had spotted the same car that Stephen had described he had seen at 7:30, and the police basically told them, you don't know your cars at all. So they were being extremely sexist and thinking that women didn't know their cars, and they were turned away because they didn't want somebody else coming forward saying they spotted the same car Stephen did. And when I read this, I thought, wow, because I know my cars. And if a guy ever told me I didn't know my cars, I would punch him in the face. By the end of the week, the OPP had 2 more reports of a 59 Chevy being spotted in the area. So say you question Marshall June 11th about that car that he said he had spotted on the outskirts of Clinton, and 10 p.m. that night, an officer in Goderich had actually clocked another car speeding on a back road, driving a 59 Chevy that could have been mistaken for gray, and it also had Quebec license plates. So this could have been the very same vehicle that Marshall was talking about. The driver was later on found at a hotel nearby reading a newspaper, which he was not registered as being a patron there. And he just told them he was on his way towards Sarnia, and there was no further attempt to question this man. Really? Harold Graham even asked the commanding officer if he could hold a muster parade. And a muster parade is when it's a process or event when they account for all of the members of a military unit or service. And he wanted to do this so that he could line up all of the airmen, have them expose their genitalia, and be inspected. The commander refused this request, and the topic was never brought up again. So, moving on, we're now going to talk about some suspects. Before June 9th, before Lynne had disappeared, on May 21st of 1959, a 10-year-old girl named Nancy Davidson was walking home from school with 2 of her friends, and this was in St. Thomas, which is about a half an hour from Clinton. After the 2 friends split off from Nancy, she was walking alone home when a car pulled up beside her, and a man that was inside asked her if she knew of any fishing holes that were in the area. And then he suggested that she get into the car so that she could pick out a pretty present, holding up a pair of panties. And she refused to get in the car. Luckily enough, Nancy's father Glenn had pulled up behind, and she got into the car before telling him that this man had just tried to coax her into his car. So Glenn Davidson immediately called the police and told them, you know, this is who the individual is. Make sure you check under his front seat that he's got women's or girls' panties in there. So when the police finally did get to the suspect, they did check under the seat, they found a bag of panties, and they also found some alcohol. And what they discovered that this individual was none other the infamous Alexander Canuck. Alexander Canuck was 35, and he had served 7 years at the Clinton Air Force Base before he was moved over to Aylmer, and he was a sergeant. Canuck also had a bad history, unbeknownst to the OPP, of sexual and alcoholic problems, including unspecified indecent acts of exposure and drunkenness. Alexander Canuck was raised in Manitoba, and he worked as a farm laborer and a bulldozer operator. He was in the Air Force from 1941 to 1946, and again from 1950 to 1955. And he left the military so that he could take a civil service exam, and then just never re-enlisted. From 1950 to 1957, he worked at the Clinton Air Force Base, and it was very likely that he had once at some point in his career had crossed paths with Lynne Harper, Lynne's father, because he worked in the supply department. When Canuck moved to Aylmer, he never really strayed from the Clinton Air Force Base because he lived on a farm that was 12 miles from the base, and it was owned by his wife Helena. She had 2 older children, and they absolutely hated Canuck, and they didn't like his drunkenness. One son even claimed that Canuck was leeching off of his mother Helena. A week after Canuck was found coaxing Nancy Davidson into his car, he was in a St. Thomas courtroom, and he was spinning these stories as to his bizarre behavior. He claimed that the panties that were in his car were actually meant to be prizes for the fishermen at Lake Erie, which is nowhere even remotely close to where he was arrested. Another claim that he made was that he was going to be throwing a party for the children in the neighborhood and that the panties and some boxes of candy were meant to be prizes for them. Oh, brother. Unfortunately, the magistrate actually dismissed these claims, saying that there was not enough sufficient evidence to convict him of anything. The only thing that he could get him on was illegal possession of alcohol, and instead he just warned the Air Force Base of his suspicions. 11 days later, Lynne Harper disappeared. Canuck's home is no more than 15 minutes away from the intersection in which she was last seen alive. Despite the fact that Canuck did not drive a 1959 Chev, there's no proof that the murderer actually drove that specific car. She could have gotten dropped off somewhere and picked up by somebody else. In early 1959, Canuck actually purchased a 1959 light yellow Pontiac Stratachief, and it looked a lot like the Chevy 59 model because it had the same wide fins. There is no speculation that Canuck tried to pick up Lynne in that car, but during this period of time, Canuck actually had family members that were visiting from Manitoba. And obviously, like I've said before, Manitoba also had yellow in their license plates, and he could have used any of those vehicles to lure her away from the base. He did not pick up Nancy Davidson in his Pontiac Stratachief, so what did he pick her up in? On the same morning that Lynne vanished from the military base, there was 2 chief medical officers that went to the St. Thomas probation office to discuss Canuck's deteriorating mental state because of his excessive drinking, and it was increasing in frequency. 18 days after Lynne's body was discovered, Canuck left Ontario for an annual leave and was back by July 2nd with a grim prognosis because he was in the infirmary at the Elmer RCAF station. It was noted that he was suffering from extreme depression, tension, anxiety, and guilt. The psychiatrist's analysis was blunt: anxiety reaction and sexual deviation. His psychiatrist, Dr. Beach, recommended that Canuck be sent to a psychiatric clinic on July 22nd in London. By July 31st, they deemed that he was no longer depressed and they discharged him. On Monday, June 15th, just 2 days after Stephen first appeared in court, an Air Force social welfare officer named J.J. Young wrote a confidential 2-page memorandum detailing the history of Canuck's sexual patterns. Unfortunately, his name would never appear in any police or military files concerning the Harper case, and his name would not resurface again until the 1960s, when the police and the military couldn't escape his shadow. Another sexual predator that was in the area at this time was named Clayton Dennis. He was 37 years old when this case happened, and he was contracted to do electrical repair on the Air Force Base. He admits that he was involved in a little rape case that happened in 1948, and he did serve time at the Collins Bay Penitentiary. What the hell is a little rape case? He left Seaforth, which is about 10 minutes away from Clinton, in the fall of 1959, and he claims that it had nothing to do with Lynne's murder or Stephen's trial. The former wife of Dennis's best friend had stated that Dennis had talked about sexual things in a disturbing manner towards their daughters. Shortly after Lynne's death, Dennis actually was heard quoting, "She had it coming to her," or "She was asking for it." The police never questioned Clayton Dennis about any of this, and to this day, he lives in Florida and still denies he had nothing to do with the murder of Lynne Harper. Why am I even surprised by this point? Personally, I think that Canuck is probably the closest person who could have done this. A final man that was overlooked by police was somebody named Matthew Morin. At the time, he was 19 years old, and he worked as an airman at the RCAF Clinton Air Force Base. And he also worked as a lifeguard at the swimming pool that Lynne frequented. He transferred out of the base after Lynne's murder, and he was known to be abusive sexually towards his wife and his daughters. What's crazy about this is that he actually took one of his daughters into the woods and tried to rape her. And when she resisted, he tried to strangle her, which almost killed her. And these hunters came by and saw them, and that's how she got away. He also once told his wife that Stephen Truscott was innocent. He also had access to his mother's Chevy, which was a late model and had Quebec license plates on it. Ultimately, he died in 1985 and never once was questioned about anything relating to Lynne's murder. This is some great police work we got going on here. In those days, people didn't challenge the police like they do now. If they said that he did it, he did it. Even Bob Lawson was shocked because he believed it. His classmates, his teachers, everyone was shocked that he had done it because they believed everything the police was feeding to them. Probably because he didn't, and he was framed for this. Lynne's funeral was very, very large. The entire front steps of their Protestant church was covered in flowers and wreaths, and she was buried in her Girl Guide uniform. The funeral was held on June 13th, 1959, and on this day, it was a devastation for two families. One child was lost in death, and one was lost to the judicial system. And I think that Doris Truscott still kept faith that things were gonna get fixed, things were gonna get sorted out, and Stephen would walk free in due time. Because Stephen was only 14 at the time, there was a lot of questions as to whether or not he would be tried as an adult. Because if he was tried as a youth, his sentence would fall far short from being sentenced to death, and his record would be sealed. The Crown prosecution, however, was determined to have Stephen tried in an adult court, and ultimately sentenced to death for the brutality of this murder. The weekend following Stephen's arrest, they would interview 17 children and 2 adults, and over the next coming weeks, they would interview dozens more. They set up headquarters in the children's gymnasium, and they grilled each child one by one. The children had their statements typed out, and after they were typed out, they were told to sign them. And Harold Graham was actually a witness to the majority of these statements. According to some of Stephen's classmates, they were very frightened and intimidated by this process because they felt that they were being interrogated rather than interviewed and constantly questioned, "Are you sure?" Karen Allen, who was a friend of Stephen's, actually was part of these interrogations, and she admitted fully to them at one point that Stephen and her had actually kissed at a party. They even went as so far as to ask her if Stephen had ever frightened her or if he tried bolder sexual advances on her, which she stated he was not like that. He was a gentle, kind person. Well, did he try these specific sexual acts with you? And she actually started to cry. When Karen's mother got involved and told the detectives that they were crossing a line and what they were asking was totally inappropriate, they didn't bother to interview her again. 10-year-old Daryl Gilks, who I had mentioned in my previous video, was also interviewed at this time. And what he specified in his statement was he does remember seeing Stephen and Lynne the night that she disappeared together. And he also wrote that he remembers seeing Stephen wearing a red shirt, which in actuality it was a white shirt with the laces in the collar. He said he also remembers Stephen was wearing red pants, but he said he didn't remember the shoes that Stephen was wearing. In a police officer's handwriting, I didn't know what shoes he was wearing was crossed out, and underneath it was written, "brown canvas shoes." That seems suspicious to me. Police also had to fully rely on Jocelyn Goddard and Butch George. Because Jocelyn was known by her classmates and by her teacher as unreliable, difficult with school discipline, and untruthful, the police needed to make her look like a credible witness. On that Saturday, when Jocelyn was questioned by OPP officers, she told them that the Sunday before Lynne disappeared, she dropped by the Lawson's farm with a few of her girlfriends to look at the newborn calf. She then goes on to say that the following day, her and Stephen got to talking about the newborn calves in the bush, and he asked her if she would come with him to go see them on Tuesday night, as it was the most convenient time for her to go see them. Jocelyn never mentioned Stephen setting an exact time, but she did tell him that she would be at the bush around 6 o'clock, and she told him to wear something that would kind of stick out so she'd be able to spot him easily. Meanwhile, 5 witnesses stated that they saw him the evening of Tuesday, June 9th, so it wasn't like it was hard for him to be spotted in the first place. The reason why Stephen and Jocelyn were not allowed to talk about their meeting in Lawson's Butch was, according to her, because Bob Lawson did not like a lot of kids on his property. Bob Lawson never once made it clear to any child that he did not want them on his property. He had a well-deserved reputation for openness and friendliness. So, according to Jocelyn, Stephen went to her residence at around 5:50 that evening on Tuesday and asked her if she knew of any homework that needed to be done, which is odd because Stephen was in school that day and he wasn't really known to be a studious student. Her brother, who was 7 years old at the time, was the one that answered the door. So he went to tell Jocelyn, Stephen's at the door to see you. And their father backs up this whole story. However, when it comes to court, the father gives a whole other detailed event of how he came to know it was Stephen at the door. There was no evidence that the police ever once questioned this 7-year-old brother either. Surprise. Why would Stephen set up a date that they're not supposed to talk about only to show up at her doorstep 10 minutes prior in a not-so-secretive way? I don't know. Philip Burns and Butch George both still insisted in their statements that Jocelyn that night was looking for Lynne. And what's odd is that Philip Burns writes in his statement that she asked where Lynne and Stephen were, but Butch insists that she alone was looking for Lynne. How could the police prove that she was only interested in looking for Stephen and not Lynne, when both Philip Burns and Butch George stated that she was looking for Lynne? That Saturday during questioning, the police had her write a 4th statement out. So remember in the last video I said she had 3 statements? This is now her 4th statement. And she had to say that during the time that she ran into Butch George and Philip Burns, she was looking for Stephen and not Lynne. However, police needed Philip and Butch to both change their statements to corroborate Jocelyn's 4th and newest statement. They both insisted that Jocelyn inquired about Lynne, and they never changed their statements, even at trial. Also, in Jocelyn's statement, there was a lot of time gaps that didn't seem to make any sense. She stated that at 6:30 she went to the Lawson's farm to look for Stephen. She then biked down the county road, where she ran into Brian Glover, who is another fellow classmate of theirs, and then bumped into Philip and Butch George before continuing to the bridge. When she was at the bridge, she said it couldn't have been past 7 o'clock when she finally decided to return to the farm. She was there for a lengthy period before she decided to return home, and this was between 8:30 and 9 o'clock at night. This would make it that she was at the Lawson's farm for 90 minutes. Philip, Butch, and Brian all stated that they saw her between 7:15 and 7:20, not 6:30 or 6:45. Jocelyn was obviously way off her timing. Not only that, not one child or adult, besides Butch for obvious reasons, had stated that they even saw her at the bridge that evening. At least a dozen people who were at that bridge that weekend not once even said they saw Jocelyn. Not even Brian Glover, who she claimed she tried to start a conversation with him. That Saturday, June 13th, Hakesayu then went to Bob Lawson's farm to get his statement, and not once was he ever questioned as to whether or not he saw Jocelyn the night that Lynne disappeared. It wasn't until June 25th, which was 12 days after he wrote his original statement, that he did say to police that he saw Jocelyn the night that Lynne disappeared, but it was at 7:25, an entire hour after she claimed to have been at the Lawson's farm. He remembers the time because she asked what time it was and he checked his watch. Bob Lawson even told the police that Jocelyn had told him she went to the bush before she even got to his farm looking for Stephen. Not that she went to the bush after visiting Lawson's farm, which is what she wrote in her original statement. That made it obvious that Jocelyn's statement was false and that she actually went to the bush first before going to the Lawson's farm. If Jocelyn was at the Lawson's farm at 7:25 and Stephen was at the schoolyard at 7:25 about to bike Lynne to Highway 8, that would explain why they never saw each other. Police never questioned Lawson as to the second visit that Jocelyn claims to have had there, which was 90 minutes long between 7 and 8:30. But Lawson later stated that it was actually not 90 minutes, it was only a couple of minutes because he was busy and had to get barn chores done. So out of the 2 hours that Jocelyn was not home, she can technically only account for 30 minutes of the 2 hours. Whatever she was up to that night, Jocelyn, I don't think, wanted her parents or the police to know what she was up to. And eventually she would ask an adult to cover for the time that she could not account for. On the Thursday before Lynne's body was discovered and on the Friday after her body was discovered, Butch claimed that he did see Stephen and Lynne crossing the bridge together at the watering hole, just as Dougie Oates and Gord Logan both testified. And a little over an hour later, Butch is at the custard shop telling George Archibald that he had just seen Steve and Lynne together. And maybe this is the reason why George Archibald went to Lynne's house later that night. Maybe because he wanted to ask her for himself if she was actually with Stephen. But apparently he didn't believe Butch George. Brian Glover, who again saw Jocelyn that evening, as well as Paul Desjardins and Tom Gillette, all have similar accounts. Tom Gillette told Harold Graham that the Wednesday after Lynne disappeared, he remembered hearing Stephen talk about hearing a calf in the Lawson's bush, which I had stated in my previous video. He then said that that evening Stephen told a similar story to the boys that were gathered at the watering hole, and he sounded as if he was threatening Butch. Alan Durnan then talked about the fight that he had with Stephen in the boys' bathroom. Remember that? The fact that Butch was no longer an alibi, the fact that Tom mentioned Stephen's threatening manner, and the fact that Alan and him got into a fight for Stephen giving Lynne a ride to the highway were all reasons the police could paint Stephen in a negative light. When Butch gave a statement on Monday, June 15th, it wasn't until 10 days later, on June 25th, that he signed his statement. Why is it that he, out of all the other kids that had to sign statements, had to wait so long to sign his, when all the others only had to wait a day or two? It's speculated that the OPP had Butch tied around their finger, and they threatened that if he did not say that Stephen did this crime, that he would be charged with helping Stephen to cover it up. They would use Butch's unverified account of seeing Stephen going into the bush with Lynne and his anger towards his peers when teased about it at school as a way to make him guilty. In Butch's formal police statement, he stated that he told Alan Durnan that he saw Stephen and Lynne at the bush. But when he went to the custard shop, he told several boys that he saw Stephen and Lynne go into the bush. There was no reason for the OPP's top homicide investigator to question Butch when and where he saw Lynne and Stephen going into the bush. The fact that he was willing to testify and state that he saw it happening was enough for an eyewitness testimony. Either they were too afraid to ask Butch the truth, knowing that what he was going to say was untruthful, or he told them a false account and they didn't believe him. Here is a timeline of Butch's statements. On the Tuesday that Lynne went missing, Butch would tell anyone and everyone about his account of seeing Steve and Lynne going into the bush. On Wednesday night, Stephen and Butch were at the watering hole with the friends he told the previous day about Stephen and Lynne going into the woods, and denying it then that he even told them about it. On Thursday morning, Butch told the police that he saw Stephen and Lynne together, but not at the bush. They were actually going over the bridge across the river. And the following Monday, he swears he did not see Stephen or Lynne that day. Not at the bridge, not at the bush, not until Tuesday evening at 9 p.m. when he visited him at his home. And do you remember Mike George, whom Butch told Lynne was raped? He was claiming as early as Wednesday that Lynne was raped. Not missing, but raped. And for some reason, the police didn't even think to question Butch about these allegations, whether or not he was covering for Mike or whether Mike knew more than Lynne being raped. Not only that, how could Graham not notice that both of his star witnesses had contradicting stories? Like, for instance, how at the bush, she was saying that she was looking for Stephen when, according to Butch, she was looking for Lynne and he was looking for Stephen. The only child's statement that was a solid alibi for Stephen was Gord Logan. He never wavered from his story. He told the exact same story every single time he was interviewed or questioned about the incident. And the only thing that was standing in his way was the distance he was from the bridge when he saw Stephen and Lynne crossing over. Dougie Oates was also still adamant that he had seen Stephen and Lynne crossing the bridge, and he was a lot closer to them when they had crossed over the bridge. The only problem was that Dougie Oates had mentioned that he saw Stephen and Lynne either a half an hour before or half an hour after 7 p.m. This would mean that if Dougie Oates saw Stephen at 6:30 p.m., then he must have been confused and that Stephen was actually alone at that time because multiple people had seen Stephen at 6:30 just biking up and down the county road. Police wanted to destroy Dougie Oates as an alibi for Stephen and tried to make it that he left the bridge before 7 o'clock. But according to Dougie Oates' mother, she said that he arrived home at 7:20 or 7:30. Police ignored this from her and just assumed that she had confused the dates. Dougie also stated that he saw Butch at the river, but of course, Butch George got there at 7:30, which would corroborate Dougie's story. That Saturday, June 13th, at 6:45 p.m., John Erskine actually went to Lawson's Bush to take pictures of the bicycle tracks. And what he realized was that it hadn't rained since May. The bicycle tracks that were there were deeply embedded into the mud, which would mean that they had to have been made when the soil was wet. And the only time that the soil was wet was a week before Lynne was murdered. This would eventually give Erskine doubts of Stephen's guilt. When Harold Graham was talking to his superiors and updating them about what was going on with the case, he knew one of the things he had to do was create a more solid timeline of the events of the evening of June 9th. And this was because there were so many witnesses that had come forward stating that they saw Stephen leave between 7 and 7:30 and then returning between 7:45 and 8 o'clock. A half an hour isn't long enough time for Stephen to bike Lynne into the bush, hide his bike, subdue her, strangle her, undress her, rape her, place her, and then clean himself up and return back to the base. It is just not possible. Biking to the bush and then walking down the path into the bush takes approximately 15 to 20 minutes, which would leave Stephen with 10 to 15 minutes to do the crime itself. Several boys that were playing baseball all agreed that Stephen was gone for approximately 20 to 30 minutes. Some kids stated that they even saw Stephen rolling up to the playground around 8:15. And there were also some other ones that said that they saw Stephen earlier, around 7:45 or 8 o'clock. Philip Burns was actually of use to the prosecution because he claims that he left the pond or the swimming hole at 7 p.m. and was returning home walking down the county road. And when he did, he actually bumped into Richard Gallatley. But he said he didn't see Stephen or Lynne. So prosecution could argue that if he didn't see them, they must have detoured somewhere else. Precisely the bush. Officer Erskine then took the 2 bicycle tires that were on Stephen's bike and he compared them to the tire tracks that he found embedded in the mud, and he found that there was not a match. What Erskine also did was he had somebody park a 1959 Chevy at the corner where Lynne was last seen alive, along with different colored plates, and he stood 300 feet away at the bridge and took pictures to prove that you can't see the plates from that far away. This was an inaccurate test because the human eye can adjust to lighting that is far away from what it can see in order for the image to be clearer. But a camera can't do the same thing, therefore it only captures what it sees, which is based on what the police want you to see because of the lenses that they put on the camera. They also fingerprinted Stephen, and they took Lynne's shoes and tried to take some prints off of it, and they found that it was not a match. And one other thing that I should mention is that the locket with the RCAF crest on it that Lynne had lost actually was not found right away when her body was found. While picking strawberries with her sister along the county road, a young girl named Sandra Archibald had discovered the locket on the roadside, and the chain was hanging inside of the fence along the lower barbed wire of the fence. The location in which the locket was found was crucial because the prosecutors didn't think that Stephen and Lynne entered the bush from the county road because they would have been easily spotted. They assumed that he turned into the laneway from the side, which was approximately 2 football fields from where the locket was discovered. There was also speculation that he could have held onto the locket for a few days before throwing it into the bush, where it got caught on the barbed wire fence after the fact. The only solution that they could come up with was Stephen must have put it there between Tuesday and Friday after the murder was committed, making it that it was completely overlooked by police when they were scouring the area. And on June 17th, Sayu was at that exact location collecting soil samples just 4 feet away from the barbed wired fence, which would have made it easy for him to spot the locket. But he didn't see it. The locket was discovered the very next day. There is a very, very real possibility that somebody could have placed or thrown it there shortly before Sandra discovered it 10 days after Lynne's murder. If it was placed at that time, that would mean that Stephen is innocent because he was behind bars at that point. So if it wasn't Stephen, who did it? So, because Stephen is now in prison, the Truscotts were ordered or kind of pushed to move off of the military base. Dan Truscott was transferred to a base up in Ottawa, and Doris and the kids moved into a trailer park to be near Stephen. The Truscotts didn't have a lot of money, but they managed to actually hire a defense lawyer called Frank Donnelly. And the reason for this was because he actually wanted to be a part of this case so badly that he set aside his plans of being appointed as a Supreme Court justice just so that he could defend Stephen in this case. Alan Oates, who saw Stephen at the bridge at 7:45 that evening, was going to be a crucial witness for Donnelly. Corporal George Edens also drew the crime scene several times for Frank Donnelly so that he thought maybe every time he drew it, some new information would come about, but it didn't seem to help. And George Edens was actually very close with Dan Truscott. Before his trial, his family physician, Dr. John Addison, so this is the same doctor that looked over Stephen just before he was formally charged by police, he requested that Stephen be seen by a psychotherapist or a psychologist or whoever because he thought maybe Stephen had mental problems. When seen by doctors about his mental state, the doctors concluded that he was quiet, but polite and apathetic. There was no signs of a gross mental illness. They also said he had anxiety, which is normal for anybody facing a murder charge like this. Frank Donnelly tried to keep Stephen out of an adult court, but unfortunately the magistrate, his name was Dudley Holmes, had other views of this case. I'm going to read to you a quote that he said was the reasoning behind Stephen staying in adult court. "The interests of the community demand that the accused be proceeded against by indictment in the ordinary court for the good of the child." Are you trying to tell me that you're trying this boy in an adult court because the community wants it? He's 14 years old. Holy my God. I don't know. Anyway, I'm gonna end it here. And thank you so much for tuning in. I'm gonna really try and wrap up this case in the next video because, like I said, there's so much more. I won't go into as much detail. I'll just briefly scour the court case and the aftermath of everything before his... We'll get to that. Anyway, thank you for tuning in. See you later, folks.